So this is a wonderful gathering this evening, and we're going to be discussing how, as disciples of Christ, we can break that cycle of media polarization, and in one way to be truly countercultural as a Catholic Church in the United States. Our discussion tonight will focus on the impact of polarization in Catholic media, a response as Catholic media organizations, so how can we respond, and then the role of Catholic media in bridging the divide for the country and the world. And tonight we have with us two amazing media professionals who will give their thoughts on this important topic, and then they will give a brief, then together we will have a brief discussion about their comments. So I'd like to introduce first Jeanette De Melo. She is the Register's, National Catholic Register's editor-in-chief and co-host of EWTN Radio's Register Radio. From 2005 to 2012, she was the communications director for the Archdiocese of Denver. Previously, she was the associate communications director for the Archdiocese of New Orleans. She holds a licentiate degree from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome and a bachelor's degree from Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, where in 2018, she also received an honorary doctorate. She lives in the greater New Orleans area with her husband and 3 children. So we welcome Jeanette De Melo. And we have with us Joe Ferullo, who is the CEO and publisher of the National Catholic Reporter. He had served on the NCR's board of directors since 2018. Joe was previously an executive vice president of programming at CBS, overseeing several long-running shows, developing new programs, and helping guide his division's transition to digital media. Before his time at CBS, Joe worked as a journalist. He was a senior-level producer at NBC News for the program Dateline NBC. He won an Emmy Award as part of the NBC team covering the events of 9/11, and an Emmy nomination for his story about the children of American Vietnam War refugees. He is a graduate of Columbia University, and Joe lives in Los Angeles, where I am, with his wife Sylvia and their 2 grown daughters. So let's welcome Joe Ferullo. So Jeanette, I'd like to ask you to please begin our conversation, share your thoughts on Catholic media and polarization.
Good, thank you. So let me begin by congratulating the Paulists and the organizers of this summit. You've managed to get the 2 NCRs not only in the same room, but sitting at the same table and talking about the same topic. In the polarized world of Catholic media, that's quite an accomplishment. For decades, the culture war narrative has dominated our Catholic public discourse in the United States, and the 2 NCRs have come to represent 2 sides of an epic battle within the Catholic Church. It's easy to fit me into one of those camps, a particular camp in this clash. I went to Franciscan University. I went to an Opus Dei school, Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, and I worked for Archbishop Charles Chaput in Denver. And I've been working for EWTN for 12 years, first as the editor-in-chief and now executive director. So this marks me in some circles with the political term conservative. In other circles, it marks me as institutional media. But I think that is a simplistic view that sells the work of the Register and the history of the Register short. And really, battle language isn't my style. So I didn't become a Catholic journalist because I wanted to win a fight or to change the church. I'm a Catholic journalist because I believe the church has the answer to the longings of every human heart, and I hope to present that answer to others. So we were asked to answer a few questions, and the first question is, how has polarization of society impacted our newsrooms? And so I want to frame this a little more closely because I don't think polarization itself is necessarily a bad thing. There's a natural kind of polarization that's an expression of different goods in tension with one another, like the swinging of a pendulum. If the National Catholic Reporter succeeds in its emphasis on social justice, and if the National Catholic Register succeeds in its emphasis on life issues, we will both have pleased God by serving the common good of society. There's also a supernatural kind of polarization that Jesus describes in the 10th chapter of Matthew. Do not think that I have come to bring peace upon the earth. I have come not to bring peace, but the sword. I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's enemies will be those of his household. This is polarization, but it's obviously not the kind we're here to discuss. The kind of polarization we're here to talk about today is neither productive nor holy. It's toxic, and we can see it all around us. It's a kind of polarization that demonizes our opponents and foments a culture of contempt, as we've heard so much about today. We see this especially today in politics, and again, we've been talking about this. Politics has become everything. It's split families and it's consumed identities. And for many in society, it's as if God himself has become partisan. Carlo Lancilotti, a professor of mathematics and physics and a translator of the work The Crisis of Modernity by Italian political philosopher Augusto Del Noce, sees today's toxic politicization as being driven in part by secularization. And after the January 6th riots at the US Capitol, he told the Register, in some sense, the work here is to rediscover the religious sense, our deepest human needs and questions, and to put politics back in its place. He said, I have to take a step back and take a deep breath and realize there are bigger things than politics. I think we all have to do that sometimes, but very few people seem to be taking that step back. I've been at the Register for 12 years. This is my fourth election cycle. And it's always a slog during an election cycle to remain above the fray. But each year has just grown more and more extreme, and I have a feeling this year is not going to be any different. The pressure of political polarization on the Register is perhaps best illustrated by a comment we received in our combat box last week. It was in a story that editorialized about Trump's dwindling pro-life position. And the comment epitomized just how outsized politics has become. The commenter said, politics is a zero-sum game. Any criticism of Trump aids Biden. Clearly, with that kind of comment, you can see the secular worldview has affected our society. It's also affected our church and our newsroom, which brings me to the second question put before us today. How have we responded to the challenges posed by this polarization? First of all, I don't think there's a person in the room who hasn't felt the wounds of the church, especially in the sexual abuse scandal. And we feel these wounds in the church every time we see the human condition, our human condition, in the form of all the scandals of incoherence and division. But as journalists, we have to cover this sometimes bad news. But that doesn't mean these troubles define our experience of the church. Despite the strife that's clearly visible, my colleagues and I are filled with hope, and many of our readers are hopeful too. So I wanted to share with you, as a way of showing what our newsroom is trying to do in this polarized world, I want to give you 7 points that render an account of our hope, to quote St. Peter. So if you consider last year, this might be surprising to some of you, the Register article that received the most traffic on our website was titled, Praying for Pope Francis. It received nearly 250,000 page views. It was written by Father Roger Landry for the occasion of the Pope's 10th anniversary. And he wrote, in every papacy, there are some who are better at complaining about the Pope than praying for him. It's a good practice to challenge those who criticize the Pope, whether they pray for him as much as they protest. So in our newsroom, the very first thing we do is we pray together. Every editorial meeting begins with this prayer, Lord, shelter our Holy Father, the Pope, under the protection of your Sacred Heart, be his light, his strength, and his protection. in his consolation. Amen. We pray for each other, and we keep our EWTN news chaplain and the Poor Clares of Perpetual Adoration very busy with our prayer requests and our thanksgivings. But secondly, we carry the Pope's words throughout the world. Our coverage of the Pope and the Church begin with prayer, but it doesn't end there. So outside of Vatican media itself, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find another outlet that amplifies the Pope's words as much as we have through our live broadcasts, our news reports at EWTN News Nightly, and the articles from Catholic News Agency, the Register's partner service. Our papal trips our paper trip coverage are like no other, and this year there was one that really comes to mind, and that's the trip the Pope took to Mongolia. It was the first time a Pope had visited Mongolia. It's a population, a tiny Catholic population, 0.04% Catholic. And we had 2 reporters on the ground there. They told us that the government sent a message indicating when the Pope landed to all cell phones in the country. That was how important this was an event in Mongolia, and we were able to carry that throughout the world. So the third point is we strive to have a global perspective. Pope Francis has asked us to go out to the peripheries, and EWTN News has done that with teams in Rome, Germany, Africa, South America, and the Middle East. And a quick glance of the Register's stories would show you that we have also sought to go out to the peripheries. We've covered a Catholic community in Kyrgyzstan, the unfolding of a hunger crisis in Tigray, Ethiopia, and some efforts made by Catholic institutions in our country to address mental health crises amongst teens and young people. And this is all just in the last couple of weeks. We want to cover the universality of the Church, and we strive to do so. We also strive to think fourthly with the Church. And so at the Register, all of our political coverage is done through the lens of social teaching. Pope Francis gave us a useful tool just a couple weeks ago of a summary of Catholic social teaching in Dignitas Infinita. And that document restates a host of assaults against human dignity, from abortion to surrogacy to transgenderism to poverty and war to violence against women and capital punishment. At the Register, each election cycle, we try to do a voter's guide. We do a voter's guide, and that voter's guide covers many of those same issues. We did one in 2020, and we're preparing to do one now in 2024. And that guide tries to cover a range just like Dignitas Infinita covered. But this broad range is not only something we do during the election years, it's something we do year in and year out. Fifthly, we strive to have an evangelical context to our news telling. So EWTN is independent. That means it's not an organ of the Church, but it does exist solely to serve the Church. It's an apostolate that has its mission to bring Christ, the eternal Word, to the world. Our journalism, whether in a selection of what we cover or how we source a story, reflects the advancement of truth as revealed by God and taught by the Church. But it's very important. In our news coverage, in our newsroom, you'll often hear us say, we seek to be right, not first, and we strive to bring light, not heat. Sixth, we recognize the polarizing power of today's communications media and work to counter it. Sister knows this very well. The internet tempts us to see our neighbor as a faceless enemy. Social media lets us take part in quarrels of strangers. Marketers sell sensationalism, and algorithms put us in silos, and partisans push ideology. So we work to avoid the pitfalls of monetized contempt, and I think the balance of our stories shows it. I talked about the top story on our website, but the top Twitter post, or X post in the last year, was a sad story. It was tragic news out of Nigeria of a Catholic priest being burnt alive. But a number 2 story was an edifying story about the Sacred Heart, and number 3 was this story. Francis reminds us that traditions of the Church should always prioritize spreading the gospel, not ideologies. That's Catholic media, that's Catholic journalism in essence. It's telling the paradoxical story of the good news of the cross alongside the good news of the resurrection. Seventh, we engage in a periodic examination of conscience. And Pope Francis wrote about this last year in a document, Towards Full Presence, and this was on social media. And he asked us to do a proper examination of our consciences about our presence on social media. But a colleague of ours, who's not in this room, it's one of the few Catholic media that isn't represented tonight, is John Allen at Crux. And he wrote a book in 2023. It's called Catholics and Contempt. It provides a great framework for Catholic journalists to take an examine, to make an examine. And I'm going to use what he said to provide 3 questions we should be asking ourselves. Do we seek to be close enough to get the story right, but far enough away to remain objective? Do we tell the whole story, taking care to provide information to put breaking news in context? And do we seek to create a Catholic commons in which friendships can be formed and areas of common ground can be found? If we constantly check ourselves against these questions, our journalism will surely diminish the culture of contempt. And so now I conclude. How do we bridge the divide? That was the last question. And I'll go back to how I started my remarks. We want to look at what terrain is it that we're trying to bridge. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis wrote, "The devil always sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites. And he always encourages us to take a lot of time thinking which is worse." He goes on to say, you can see why, of course. He relies on your extra dislike of one error to draw you into the opposite error. So I'll say that again. He relies on your extra dislike of one error to draw you gradually into the opposite extreme, opposite error. But we should remember, being pro-life is not the opposite of being pro-family. Love of God in the Blessed Sacrament is not the opposite of love of God in the least of our brothers. And divine justice is not the opposite of divine mercy. All of us know this in this room. The only opposite and should be drawn to is the eternal word. So I'm from New Orleans, and I take extra pride in closing with this quote from John Paul II when he visited the Superdome in 1987. He said, "What is the opposite of deception? Where can you turn to find the answers that satisfy? The opposite of deception is truth, the person who tells the truth, the person who is true. Yes, the opposite of deception is Jesus, who tells us, 'I'm the way, the truth, and the light.'" So our approach in Catholic media should be to present Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, with truth, beauty, and goodness, so that faith, hope, and love may grow in human hearts and in the history of men and women of our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanette, and now we will hear from Joe.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that's unfortunate. Okay. First, my thanks to Father Rene and to Father Ricky, to Sister Nancy, for arranging this and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for tackling this question as your mission for the year. I agree with Jeanette, it gets more and more important, it seems, day by day, let alone year by year. Let me talk on my part in a way that reflects my experience in secular media and transfer it into what I see happening in Catholic media and the Catholic Church. There are obvious similarities, but it comes from my observations as a television executive and journalist in the secular media. And I'll tackle it in a certain way that will answer these 3 questions. In American politics, there used to be something, those of us who are old enough to remember, called the Catholic vote. It was blue-collar, ethnic, and reliably democratic. There was something of a Catholic consensus. Those days are gone, with a lot of consensus in this country. Now, maybe Catholics didn't always agree that much behind the scenes, but we kept our agreements inside our own house, and we spoke of them with our inside voices. But nobody speaks for their inside voices in America anymore today. Not the church, not the media, not the guy on the street. There are 3 parts to this problem, 3 pieces to this puzzle, and each are interlaced with each other. And I'm not trying to give the media a pass here. We are responsible, but it is part of a larger picture. First, the loudest voices in the room. This is new for Catholic leaders. To have Catholic leaders, including bishops, speaking out against doctrinal issues, against the Pope, usually with a microphone in their hand and a camera nearby. And the U.S. is unique in this. There are disagreements all over the Catholic world, Germany and Africa, for instance. But most every place else, people try to use their inside voices. Praise publicly, criticize publicly. Here at home, we are exposed to something in the church that is close to our sect of media. Shouting conducted through the media. It's important to understand just how unusual this is, because that unusualness is the definition it is. We have to cover. We should cover. Obviously, the question is how. That leads into the second piece of the puzzle, Catholic media. Everything I've just described, loud, rude, sanctimonious positioning and posturing, catnip to those of us in the media. We love it. One, because yes, it's unprecedented, and that is the definition of news. But two, let me be honest, that kind of conflict is easy to report. It's a good way to get your attention. It's like, hey, look, there's a fight going on over there. Look at the video. Read the angry quotes in bold. Don't touch that dial. But it can all become addictive. And I mean the word addictive, which brings me to the third piece, the audience. Studies show that anger is an addiction. It provides that rush that people seek to replicate again and again. Look, obviously we see this on cable news. We read about it all the time. Everything is nothing less than the survival of the planet, the survival of our values. And people give into it because on some level, that rush of anger feels good. You feel alive. You're sitting by yourself in your home, in front of your television set, in front of your computer screen, and suddenly you've been woken up by something outrageous. And in a society where, I think, real flesh and blood forms of community are in decline, that becomes the substitute. But, like any addiction, that rush of anger needs to keep escalating in order to be effective, in order for the addiction to be fed, whether it's Capitol Hill or some cardinal. In fact, we're now at a point where, according to several surveys, substantial segments of American society identify their religion based on their politics, not the other way around. They do a checklist of political issues, secular issues, and then define their faith from there. I believe this on climate change or not, et cetera, go down the list. Therefore, I am an evangelical, a mainline Protestant, a Catholic, a certain kind of Catholic, as if the Gospels were a political platform. What can we do? Pope Francis has said that every Catholic communicator, quote, must do his or her part to ensure that every form of communication is objective, respectful of human dignity, and attentive to the common good, which sounds like the opposite of the anger addiction cycle. How do you get there? Media literacy is one important way. The Daughters of St. Paul, Sister Nancy especially, have been involved in a project, trainings on media literacy. They saw this problem coming quite some time ago. And it's helpful. Studies show that most people don't differentiate between straight news story, just the facts, and a piece of commentary. To them, it's all the media. What does NCR try to do? Doesn't sound like a big deal, but we have copy editors and fact checkers. And so does the New York Times, so does the Wall Street Journal, but most mid-sized and small newspapers in the country don't have those anymore. They can't afford them. So things go unchecked. And slowly but surely you begin to question everything you read, and you wonder if it's true or not. Secondly, you try hard to reject commentary that seems based on anger and nothing more, where anger is a replacement for an argument. You can be passionate, you can be angry, but you have to present a logical argument that ideally, even if someone disagrees with you, that person at least sees how you got there and respects the argument. And we tried to focus more on our spiritual content. More on that in a second. But first, I think we need to be aware really of the depth of the challenge here. Our direct audiences for the two NCRs are a small slice. What happens from there is what really matters. What happens from there is that what we report on, the commentary we publish and broadcast, gets sliced up into a million different pieces and thrown out on social media. And we have no control over that. Whatever we write, it gets taken out of context, it gets radically reinterpreted, and there's really not much we can do. But here's where the hope lies. Most average Catholics say they are tired of all of this. In the US Synod reports, they lamented the way politics and ideology have infected faith, have taken away from their time with God, have taken away from the sense that their faith is transcendent. Politics is a lot of things. Transcendent is not one of them. For us in the media, there's a business opportunity. If most people don't want to live in that world anymore, polarization, maybe we show them the way not to do it, and maybe they'll read us more. Maybe there are audiences out there that we're missing. I'm missing. And it's worth giving it a try. And we see this a bit with NCR in our spiritual content. Month after month, we do audience engagement, so when people read us and what stories did they read online. And Pope Francis is always up there. Some culture issue, like gender, is always up there to the top. But right there with that is our spiritual content. Month after month after month, no matter what else is going on in the Catholic world and the world at large. It's one way that Catholic media can encourage positive communication. It's one way that we can say to people, this is who we are as Catholics, here's what brings us together despite the other stuff. But, and here's where I'm going to give us a little room to excuse ourselves, the media can't do this alone. We can't do it without help from that first piece of the puzzle, those leaders with the loudest voices in the room. If they just put down the megaphones and stepped away from the cameras, they could build a positive community too, by returning to that work of being pastors that supposedly drew them to the church to begin with. This is part of what Francis's wish was to communicators, that we focus more on the roots of our faith, quote, with hearts demilitarized by the gospel. Look, that goes for the audience, that goes for the media, but that also goes for those who seem convinced that God only hears them when they're shouting through a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thanks for that little shout out about media literacy. It's crucial to form audiences on how to engage thoughtfully and with discernment about media messages. And that's perhaps not something we do very well in the Catholic Church as a whole and within faith formation. So if anybody wants to know more, you can come to my workshop tomorrow. But you mentioned that the anger in political speech has become addictive. And I think that is such an intriguing thought. And I know Father Tom and Father Stephen kind of alluded to this as well. You mentioned how to respond to the comments that you receive, sometimes on the opinion pages. But how do you think Catholic media as a whole can break that addiction, or what could be the antidote to the addictive rage that we see, and how can Catholic media respond to that? Do you think?
I'll go first. It's not easy. It's not easy. One way you can respond, and I think this is what Janette was getting at as well, is to offer a wider menu of stories to people. To not only offer the quick, easy hit of polarization and anger, and here's what someone said yesterday, isn't that horrible? and by increasing things like spiritual content and other kind of features. I think we do a good job of reviewing secular art, but through a Catholic lens. And that helps people see the church in a different way and in a wider way. How you stop people from doing something like that, I don't really know. One way, and we're not good at it. We're not. And the secular media isn't good at it either, is not to rush to say everything everybody says that seems outrageous. Sometimes that's just what they want. And sometimes there's not much to it other than that soundbite of outrage. And sometimes we have to turn away from our addiction too and go, we can skip this one.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeanette, I don't know if you have any comments to that.
I mean, especially to that last point, I mean, sometimes you learn to sit on it, and watch where this goes. And that's that idea of being right, not first. I mean, it doesn't have to be right. It's just sitting there and watching what unfolds from this. And if you can bring any light to it, right? But I would also say influencers, I think to your question, how do we stop the anger? I mean, make sure your reporters aren't urging it on as they work their way through social media. And I think that's a very important way is, influencers who are a part of your sphere need to have that same mindset that they're not going to foment anger by, using triggers really to speak to maybe an audience they already have.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for your insights, Jeanette. I want to go back to what you said about Catholic social teaching as the lens through which we address everything in society and politics as Catholic media professionals, to highlight the first principle of human dignity, the dignity of every human being, can seem so obvious, but as we see in the culture, it's not so obvious. How do you see Catholic social teaching become a guide for how Catholic media can communicate important issues or even controversial issues?
Right. Well, I mean, to speak the obvious for my audience, I spoke about us being conservative and labeled as conservative, and that probably means a good deal of our readership are Republicans, right? It also means that there are certain issues that they champion and certain issues they don't. They would not champion the death penalty. They would not, they would tend to be very nuanced in immigration or even have extreme views on immigration sometimes. Some audience. I mean, I'm not talking, I don't want to lump everybody in as one audience, but, there are certain elements of our audience that don't quite understand the full range of social teaching on some of those issues. And so we really try to cover what the church teaches on those issues with all of the nuance that is involved in them, because they're not simple issues. Especially those prudential judgment issues where you can have a differing opinion as long as you've got the same basic principle that you're trying to achieve. Immigration is one of the big ones. So our audience doesn't like it when we get into that. Sometimes a segment of the audience may become very vocal about that coverage, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to cover it. Mm-hmm. And what I do find is sometimes it's best to cover those things that are most sensitive, or maybe where there's room for the audience to grow. Their stories, rather than commentary, rather than what so-and-so has said about this, but they're the stories of people who are living in those situations. Right. Immigration, again, that's easy. There are people who live on the border, who have the challenge of the influx, but they also are people who are suffering through a coming. And so to cover that in its totality, I think is very, very important. And one example of us doing that as media was several years ago, writing a joint editorial on the death penalty that was signed by, I can't remember all of this, but I know it was the NC Register, Father Malone at America kind of spearheaded, and it was just really something that was quite out of the ordinary, and I think very important.
To coming together as Catholics to really address some major issues. And Joe, the reporter, has had that emphasis of social justice and addressing social issues from the Catholic perspective. I mean, how would you say that is the lens and addressing sometimes these really difficult or polarizing issues in society?
Well, I have to agree with Jeanette. I think a lot of our readers as well, as committed as we've always been to social justice, don't quite understand every piece of it. You know, look, in one way or another, we're all cafeteria Catholics, and some people are on a very different line, getting different dishes than other people. And one example, most recently, was October 7th. And the Israeli-Hamas conflict. The first thing we did on it was a call to nonviolence, and remembering that the first Intifada was run by a nonviolent advocate and tried to cue to nonviolence, and a call for the Palestinians to do that again, to go there. We got a lot of angry mail about that, because this is a war, and Israel has a right to defend itself. What are you talking about, nonviolence? Or the Palestinians have a right to attack. Look what's happened to them. And I felt we had to be very measured in what we wrote about a conflict involving the Jewish people, because Catholics have a long history of not being particularly nice to Jewish people. And I feel like we had to be respectful of where they were coming from. But we kept doing things about nonviolence. And we kept getting complaints from both sides about it, who felt we were not adhering to Catholic social justice. Because they brought their politics to a Catholic social justice lens, not the other way around. And if you start with that lens, then you say, yeah, probably nonviolence. Maybe it sounds a little crazy right now, but it probably is the answer.
Thank you. You both alluded to this a little bit, both how spirituality and presenting the Catholic spirituality to your readers can make a difference in how they engage with the world and how they engage their faith with the world. But kind of alludes to this idea that, you know, maybe it's looking at ourselves and helping us to grow in our conversion, growing in our relationship with Christ. And as Father Tom says, you know, look at ourselves first. How do you think Catholic media organizations can grow in that sense of conversion and examination, as you mentioned, Jeanette? Can you share a little bit more about how that can become more of a reality within the Catholic media organizations so that it is what we also communicate to the world?
The first thing that came to mind, and it's not so spiritual, I guess, is getting out there with people. I mean, like being at an event like this, I don't mingle with you all very often, and it's good to be with you, and to recognize that we need to seek opportunities to be with others, and that means other journalists, or you know, a reporter. Let's say I have a reporter who's typically on, you know, kind of the pro-life beat or something like that. Like sending them to do something else. You know, like get off of that. That's your focus. That's kind of your beat. But let's send you to get on the ground somewhere else so that you broaden your own scope of what you're covering and understand issues and people that you might not have already done. Reporters sometimes they're very shy. You know, it's kind of funny. People who like to write can be very introverted. And so they get stuck in a rut. All of us do. I get stuck in a rut. You know, everybody does. So getting them out of their normal environment and into another one, they will learn something because they're inquisitive. Sure. And so I think that's a really good way of just broadening people's minds. And sometimes that also broadens people's hearts, right? And I think that's very important. Our culture in our newsroom is very spiritual. We pray. We really do pray for each other a lot. We have a virtual chapel. We've all been talking about how we work virtually, but we have a virtual prayer chapel, and so we're dropping notes in that all the time. And that's very important because it also humanizes each other. And so you know when somebody's going through a tough spot. and sometimes that comes out in their writing too. I mean, anger or frustration can come out with what's going on in people's lives. And so it's just being very human about the way we direct our team and get out there and get into a story. Every story to really come from touching upon people, right? Relationship and something happened in that meeting. So, Tim?
I completely agree, and I think remoteness has made that an even more important challenge. Our reporters do interviews with people one-on-one, but via Zoom. No one walks into someone's office anymore and talks to them, or they just do it over the phone. And getting people out there again is the most important way. I remember when I was a producer at NBC News, and I would be assigned a story in the middle of nowhere. It's a small little town, and I'm bringing to that story in that town my born and raised in New York and living in LA assumptions about what these people were going to be like. And I was always insanely wrong. And I always felt incredibly humiliated. Because I found that anybody, if you give them a chance to tell you their story, will. And they'll do a good job at it in ways that surprise you and wake you up. So I agree. If we can get out there more, get out of our reporting bubbles, that's the best end.
Awesome. And we'd like to open this up to any questions that you all would have. And there are 2 microphones. So please just raise your hand and someone will come to you. There you go. Yes.
2 quick questions. One, up on what Joe just said. Do each of you feel that you have any responsibility to challenge the stereotypes that your readers have of the readers of the other NCR? So that's one. The second one is the early Berliner issue with National Public Radio has raised an issue of viewpoint diversity. And I'm sure we are all in agreement of all the other more traditional kinds of diversity, but is the viewpoint of diversity reflected in your newsrooms?
There. Mati.
Sorry, it's too late. Nothing fleeting. She just wants to say, eat up your first my question. That's all right. Doesn't mention I got them right.
So, I suspect, and I think you would agree, that your readers, both of you, your readers hold very firm stereotypes of the readers of the opposite NCR. Do you have any obligations to challenge your readers about those stereotypes?
I think that's important. And I think listening, being at a conference like this and listening to the work that is being done on these kinds of things is very important. I don't pretend to be that kind of mediator as much as I think we should aim to do better at that. But I think it's the extremes of our audiences really that have that, that maybe animosity. But it's comfortably not that anyone's really thinking about the other NCR that much. I mean, it's that basic.
But I think most important, we shouldn't be demonizing each other. We shouldn't be demonizing anyone. So I agree with that. And viewpoint diversity, I think it's the same thing. It's usually more issue diversity for us than it is viewpoint diversity because the viewpoints come with on the issues that we cover. And so that's something I have to think about a little bit more. In terms of sourcing, yeah, absolutely. In terms of commentary, we probably don't have as wide of a range in viewpoint diversity, in all honesty.
Yeah, I agree to the extent that our readers that demonize the other side are on the extreme. And they're our loudest voices in the room. And it's up to us to pay attention to them or not, to be honest. It's up to us to go, okay, this is a small slice. We love them. We're glad they read us, but it's a small slice. And they can't define for us who we are. In terms of diverse voices and viewpoints, we have a columnist named Michael Sean Winters. And Michael Sean is a very opinionated man, which is why he's a columnist. And sometimes he writes things that get people on my staff upset. And they say, we really shouldn't print that. Or can you talk to Michael about softening that? And I tell them, we don't pay Michael to write our opinions, we pay Michael to write his opinions. And that's his opinion. If you have a different point of view, you go find someone to write that. I'm happy to publish that one too. And so we try.
I had the honor of working with Cardinal Joseph Bernardin in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. John Farr, I think, is with us. And the whole notion of the consistent ethic of life is such a rich contribution of our Catholic social teaching. I find, kind of related to the previous question, our Catholic people are kind of divided between the, quote, pro-life, basically abortion, and pro-poor, basically everything else. I think that your publications have a great opportunity to evangelize our people and really turn hearts to the whole gamut of Catholic social teaching, so that we really can heal this polarization issue and get to the heart of things and show what a great treasure we have precisely as Catholics with our Catholic social teachings and consistent ethic of life to build those bridges. Just to challenge both of your publications to maybe do a little bit more evangelizing.
I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine about a month ago about the consistent ethic. He's a dear man I've known since our very early days as kids in the news business at ABC News. And he has since become Episcopalian. And he said one reason was that it seemed like the Catholic Church had disposed of the consistent ethic of life. That it focused on one piece of that and not the rest of it. And I didn't disagree. And I've always thought that the Cardinal's consistent ethic was an attempt at building a Catholic consensus again around life issues, which is, if you believe in this one, you got to believe in all of them. You don't get to pick and choose. And there's a logic to it. Even if you did disagree with certain pieces of it, there was an undeniable logic to what he was saying and to what he was trying to build that I think on its own helped to forge a consensus. But no one talks about it anymore.
Well, I don't know if nobody's talking about it because Pope Francis just gave us in our Dignitas Sanita, which is the same thing. It really is. And so I think it's going to revive the conversations. I hope so too.
We've talked a little bit about that we are in the full swings of the political cycle, and I've noticed in the media in the last month or so, growing coverage of the movement, if that's what they're calling it, of Christian nationalism, and which appears to me to be a very dangerous movement from a Christian perspective and from a perspective as a U.S. citizen. I just was wondering if, I don't know if either of your publications have written anything about that or if you're planning to do so.
A couple weeks ago, Janette Dello, one of our senior reporters, wrote on that question. And he has a range of voices. It's a result article. So Jonathan Dello the Kenneth. I'm not really exactly taking that up, so it is content and subject. If you want, I can say, talking on them, I'm going to
And Steve, I agree, it's an election year, so it's going to become an issue more and more. You ever were to go into both political conventions, and that's going to be first focused there. That's the lens they put it on it. Is who were those people in those rooms? In that perspective. The reporting we've done on it so far has been limited to a group that has gotten attention lately called Catholics to Catholics. They did a prayer meeting in Mar-a-Lago about 3 weeks ago. We did a story about that in the fall, but a couple more struggles on that. I think it overstates them to call Christian nationalists, but he's kind of plays around the edges. At least, again, I know the painted with large brush, but at least some of the folks get off.
But why them back?
And first of all, thank you, Trickle. It's been amazing to for me. And as someone who is very saddened by that, now vitriolic nature, my formerly favorite social media platform, Twitter, now X, and I used to happily share from pieces links from both of your venues, and I'm not a journalist, but I enjoy sharing those. And now I'm frequently afraid to do so not because of my own, attitudes about what will happen in the comments when I share them. So how can you encourage those of us who want to share the great work that you're doing to do so in a tenor that invites positive dialogue, if that's even possible, especially leading up to the months ahead? It's a great question. Twitter is the best RX place all of the social stating. Maybe sometimes it's highlighting what you found most interesting about that piece. So once you get it out there, still, like you said, it splinters off. So it's never that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of very neat documentaries on the topic of social media and helping clear with your head. I mean, there's an algorithm to Twitter, especially, but X, all of them, TikTok, which feeds you what the algorithm thinks you want. And so within a very quick amount of time, you're in a bubble. And you think that's the whole world. One answer, I guess, is to stay off of social media if you're a news organization. More and more news organizations are starting to get away from Twitter because they're living the new big experience. It's just become too angry and too toxic. It's unfortunate. There was a good way to reach a large audience. It was a good way to reach people who really cared about being informed. It was sort of a news feed for a lot of folks. And it's more or less gone. Other forms of social media like Instagram, we're quite involved with. It's the easiest way, the best way, cheapest way for us to reach our audience. And Instagram is less toxic. It seems to be something of a safe place as far as it was any safe place to social media.
Yeah, love my co-presentation tomorrow. Be responding to some of that. But we thank you all so much for being here, and thanks so much to Jeanette and Joe. I'm sorry? Oh, there's one more question? I was good here. Oh.
I just wanted to make a note. I was looking at your tablecloth, and I couldn't get, it says Caesar's, and I just couldn't get the gospel quote, given to Caesar what is Caesar's and given to God what is God's. And I just want to thank you both for being here and truly giving to God what is God's meant for all of us.
Just a moment to say that, as St. Paul says in Catholic media, especially, St. Paul says we're to be examples of virtue in the world as we put on love that binds the rest together and makes them perfect. But he also says that we can live this call to love if we seek that which is above, keeping our gaze fixed on Christ. And I think, thank you so much, Janette and Joe, for being here, for sharing how you in Catholic media help us to keep our gaze fixed on Christ. So thank you so much.
Thank you.